Welcome to our deep dive into the world of environmental science. Today we're focusing on India, and we'll be using this document called Environment Shankar. It covers just about everything you can imagine: pollution, renewable energy, animal diversity, even international conventions. We're not going to get to every single little detail, but we're going to pull out some of the most interesting stuff.
One of the most fascinating things about this document is how interconnected it shows all these environmental issues are. You can't just look at these things in isolation. It's about seeing how everything fits together.
Right. And so the document, it kind of starts off by, listing all the different types of pollution that are impacting India. We're talking about water pollution, soil pollution, noise pollution, radioactive pollution, even e-waste, solid waste, thermal pollution, plastic pollution. I mean, the list just goes on. Do you think it does a good job of conveying just how serious these problems are?
Yeah, it doesn't just list them, it also goes into specific examples and consequences, which I think really drives home the point. Like one example it talks about is Minamata disease, and that was caused by mercury poisoning in Japan.
Yeah. That's a pretty scary example. It really does. It highlights the long-term impact that pollution can have.
Mm.
But then the document goes on to talk about some of the solutions,
hmm
like bioremediation.
Yeah, using nature to clean up the environment. Pretty fascinating stuff. They've got, like the oil zapper, which is this bacterial mixture developed by terrieri. It helps clean up oil spills.
That's pretty neat. But is that a scalable solution? Can that be implemented on a larger scale?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Bioremediation has a lot of potential, but whether it can be scaled up to really address these widespread issues, it's a challenge for sure. It'll take a lot more research and investment in infrastructure development.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something a bit more optimistic. Renewable energy. In India, the document covers a lot of different sources: solar, wind, hydro, even fuel cells.
I like that it emphasizes the diversity of the options. Like, there's no single solution. It's about finding the right mix for different regions based on their needs and resources.
Speaking of solar, there's the International Solar Alliance. It's an initiative that's led by India to try to promote solar energy globally. They're even working on these luminescent solar concentrators that can capture sunlight from all different angles. It seems like India is really taking a lead in this area.
It's very encouraging to see. And it's not just about cutting emissions, it's also about creating a more sustainable and equitable energy future.
Right, right. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about India's incredible animal diversity. There's a mention of these red data books in the document. They're published by the IUCN, and they basically list all the threatened species. Seems like a pretty important tool for conservation efforts.
They are. They help us, really focus our efforts on the species that are most in need of protection.
So here's a little trivia question for you. The document mentions an animal in India that lives in this harsh, sandy, and saline area. And get this, it has no natural predators, but it's still considered threatened due to habitat destruction. Can you guess what it is?
Sandy and saline, no predators.
Hmm.
I'm going to guess the Indian wild ass.
That's right. It just goes to show that even species that seem really well adapted can still be vulnerable to, to human activities.
It really highlights the impact we have on ecosystems.
Yeah.
Even seemingly resilient species are affected by habitat loss.
The document also mentions the importance of mangroves for coastal protection. Their dense canopies and their strong root systems, they act like natural barriers during cyclones and tsunamis.
Yeah, this just shows you how interconnected everything is. Protecting mangroves is about conservation, but it's also about protecting coastal communities from those extreme weather events.
Yeah. Now for some fun facts. Did you know pythons actually constrict their prey to death before swallowing them whole? Just imagine.
Brutal but efficient, I guess. Nature's a wild place.
Okay, ready for another one? In aquatic ecosystems, the pyramid of biomass can actually be inverted. So that means the total mass of consumers can actually be greater than the total mass of producers. Seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about how fast phytoplankton reproduce.
Shows the unique dynamics of those systems.
Yeah.
Energy flow in aquatic environments is very different. And to conserve these systems well, we need to understand these differences.
All right. So how about some more fun facts about India's biodiversity?
Let's hear them.
Okay. Have you ever heard of the Karai camel? It's found in the Gujarat region, and get this, it can swim up to 3 kilometers in seawater.
I have. They actually graze on mangroves mostly. Perfectly adapted to that coastal environment.
That's just amazing. Life, it just finds a way to thrive in even the most unusual conditions. But it's not all good news. The document also points out some worrying trends, like the rapid decline in forest cover in Borneo and Sumatra because of all that palm oil production.
It's a tough question, isn't it? How do you balance economic development with environmental protection? The whole palm oil thing is a good example of that.
So it's a complex problem for sure. And speaking of alarming trends, there's also colony collapse disorder, which is affecting bee populations worldwide. And, bees are super important pollinators for our food crops, so it's a pretty big concern.
It's a domino effect, When pollinators like bees decline, the whole food web is affected. Our food supply, too. So what can we do to make agriculture more sustainable, to support those pollinators, and make sure we have food in the future?
It's a question we all need to be thinking about. Okay, last one. The document also talks about genetically engineered trees. On one hand, they could offer some benefits like faster growth and disease resistance, but there are worries about their ecological impact. How do you see this all playing out?
It's complicated. There are valid points on both sides. The bottom line is we have to be careful. We need to do our research, think about the ethics, especially when you're talking about new technologies that could have a big impact on the environment.
Okay, well, let's take a breath and move on to something a bit more global. International environmental conventions.
Yeah, it's good to see that we're recognizing that these issues, they don't stop at borders. You need global action to really tackle them.
The document lists a ton of key conventions. You've got the Ramsar Convention, that's all about protecting wetlands. And then CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. That one's focused on regulating the wildlife trade. It's quite a global effort to protect the planet.
It is impressive. We're talking about combating desertification, protecting migratory species. It shows that we're becoming more aware of our shared responsibility.
Let's dive a little deeper into some of them. There's the CMS, that's the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species. And then there's the ITTO, the International Tropical Timber Organization. They're working towards sustainable forestry practices. Do you think these conventions actually have a tangible impact? I mean, do they make a real difference?
Oh, they're absolutely vital, especially when you're dealing with issues that cross borders. Like migratory species. They don't care about borders. They cross multiple countries, so you need everyone working together to protect them.
Right. The document also highlights the UNFF, the United Nations Forum on Forests. They're all about promoting sustainable forest management.
The important thing is these forums allow for dialogue and collaboration. It's about finding that common ground and working together.
Okay, now for some conventions that are tackling specific threats. There's the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. That one aims to eliminate those harmful chemicals. Then there's the Basel Convention, which controls the movement of hazardous waste across borders.
We need these kinds of agreements because pollution is a global problem. These persistent pollutants, they can travel so far, end up in ecosystems miles away from where they came from.
It's a reminder that everything we do, it has consequences, sometimes far beyond what we can even imagine.
Exactly. The document also mentions the Rotterdam Convention, which is all about informed consent when it comes to certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides that are being traded internationally. It's about making sure that countries know what they're getting and can make informed decisions about what they're importing.
So transparency and responsibility globally. Makes sense.
Now, here's one that's really important for India. The UN Convention to Combat Desertification. It addresses land degradation in those dry areas, like the ones you find a lot of in India.
Absolutely. Then there's the International Whaling Commission. Their focus is on, well, whales, conserving their stocks and managing whaling. A great example of how we can work together to protect the oceans.
And speaking of working together, let's talk about the conventions tackling climate change. The document mentions the Vienna Convention, that's for the protection of the ozone layer, and the Montreal Protocol, which has actually been really successful in phasing out ozone-depleting substances.
Yeah, the Montreal Protocol, that's a good example of how international cooperation can work. It's not only protected the ozone layer, but also helped slow down climate change, since those ozone-depleting substances are potent greenhouse gases.
It's a double win, Building on that success, there's the Kigali Agreement. It's focused on phasing down hydrofluorocarbons. Those are potent greenhouse gases used in refrigeration and air conditioning.
Shows how we're continuing to work together to address climate change. And finally, there's the Minamata Convention on Mercury. It's all about protecting us and the environment from this toxic heavy metal.
Another great example of how we're taking action against a global pollutant. You can't deny it, international cooperation is absolutely essential.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're all connected and that we have to work together to protect this planet we all share.
Now, before we move on, there's one unique example of India's biodiversity we need to talk about, the Sundarbans.
The Sundarbans, what's that?
It's this incredible ecosystem down in the delta region of the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna rivers. In the Bay of Bengal, it's the biggest mangrove forest in the whole world, full of all sorts of amazing plants and animals.
Sounds incredible.
It is. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's even home to the Bengal tiger, a species that's perfectly adapted to living in that mangrove habitat.
Life finds a way, doesn't it? It's
Yeah.
amazing. And it just shows you why it's so important to protect these unique ecosystems. They're just teeming with biodiversity. This has been a really fascinating discussion.
Just scratching the surface, really.
That's right. Join us next time as we delve even deeper into India's environment. Welcome back to our deep dive into India's environment. We were talking about the Sundarbans, that incredible mangrove forest.
Yeah, the Sundarbans is like this perfect example of a complex and thriving ecosystem. And it kind of leads us into another really important topic that the document covers, which is how ecosystems actually function.
Yeah, it gets into all those relationships between organisms and their environment. It can be pretty complex, but I think the document does a good job of explaining it.
Yeah, it breaks it down into like these key concepts like energy flow, nutrient cycling, ecological succession, things like that.
Right. So starting with energy flow, the document talks about how energy basically moves in one direction, from producers like plants to consumers like animals, the whole food chain thing.
It's a pretty fundamental principle in ecology. This energy transfer is what keeps the whole ecosystem going.
And to understand that flow, the document talks about trophic levels, which is basically like a hierarchy of who eats whom. Producers are at the bottom, then you've got your primary consumers, secondary consumers, and so on.
The key thing to remember is that you lose energy at each level. So the higher up you go in the food chain, the less energy there is available.
So like a lion eating a zebra gets less energy than the zebra got from eating grass.
Yeah,
Makes sense why there are fewer top predators than herbivores.
exactly. And the document uses these visuals, they're called ecological pyramids, to help illustrate this. Like the pyramid of biomass, it shows you the total mass of organisms at each trophic level.
That reminds me of something we talked about earlier. The document mentions that in aquatic ecosystems, the pyramid of biomass can actually be like inverted.
Right. That's because in aquatic ecosystems, the producers, like phytoplankton, they reproduce so quickly that at any given time, their total mass might actually be less than the consumers that are feeding on them.
It's crazy how different environments can create these like totally unique dynamics.
Okay, so let's move on to another key function, nutrient cycling.
Nutrient cycling, it's basically nature's way of recycling, right?
Exactly. It's how these essential elements like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, they're constantly moving between living organisms and the environment. Make sure there's a continuous supply.
Yeah, the document breaks it down into these like specific pathways. The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle.
And remember those pythons we were talking about? Decomposers are a big part of this whole nutrient cycling thing. Bacteria and fungi, they break down dead organisms and waste products, releases those nutrients back into the soil.
Wow, it's incredible how it all works together. Now, what about ecological succession? That one's always been a little tricky for me to wrap my head around.
Basically, it's the process of change that ecosystems go through over time. Imagine like a barren landscape slowly turning into a forest.
Like a makeover for the ecosystem.
Exactly. And there are two types. Primary succession, which starts from scratch, like on bare rock, and secondary succession, which starts in a disturbed ecosystem, like after a fire or something.
So in both cases, it's like this gradual, step-by-step process, driven by those interactions between the organisms and the environment.
Right. One set of organisms comes in, establishes itself, and then that creates the right conditions for the next group. And over time, you see the whole community shift and change. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a specific type of ecosystem that's really important in India, forests.
Yeah, forests are so vital for so many reasons. Biodiversity, climate regulation, they give us clean air and water, not to mention all the people who depend on them for their livelihoods.
The lungs of the planet, right?
Exactly. And the document talks about all the different kinds of forests you find in India, from like tropical rainforests to those alpine forests up in the Himalayas.
It's pretty amazing how life finds a way to adapt to all these different environments.
Talk about resilient. But speaking of the Himalayas, the document also emphasizes how important they are as a water source for like a huge region. They call them the water towers of Asia.
It's crucial. But these forests, they're facing a lot of pressure. Deforestation, Illegal logging, habitat loss, all these things are taking a toll.
Yeah, is the document doing a good job of addressing these issues? I mean, are they really tackling the problem?
Absolutely. The document highlights these as major threats to the future of those forests. It stresses the need for sustainable management practices to make sure they can stay healthy and bounce back from these challenges.
Before we move on, I wanted to mention a couple of cool facts about Indian forest. Did you know India is home to the great Indian bustard? It's one of the heaviest birds that can fly.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it's critically endangered, mainly because of habitat loss.
That's right. And here's another one that surprised me. Some trees, like the sandal tree, they're actually what's called partial root parasites. So they can make their own food through photosynthesis, but they still need to get some water and nutrients from other plants.
Nature is full of these weird and wonderful relationships, isn't it? Okay, well, let's move from the mountains to the coast. What about mangroves? The document mentions them as being a really important ecosystem.
Yeah, mangroves are pretty amazing. They're these salt-tolerant trees that grow right in those intertidal zones, the areas that are flooded by the
They're
tides.
like the guardians of the coast.
Yeah, and the document highlights how important they are for protecting coastal communities from things like erosion, storms, even tsunamis.
They've got all these amazing adaptations to survive in those harsh conditions, too, like their aerial roots. Those allow them to breathe even when the soil is completely waterlogged.
It says that India has a big chunk of the world's mangrove forests,
Yeah.
especially along its eastern coast.
It just goes to show how diverse India's ecosystems are, and it highlights how important it is to protect these valuable coastal habitats. Okay, so how about we dive into the underwater world for a bit and talk about coral reefs? They're often called the rainforests of the sea.
Yeah, teeming with life.
The document does a good job of explaining the relationship between corals and the algae that live inside them. The algae give them food and those vibrant colors.
It's a symbiotic relationship, right? They need each other to survive.
Exactly. But sadly, these reefs are facing a lot of threats from pollution, overfishing, climate change, like rising sea temperatures can cause coral bleaching, which can kill off entire reefs.
It's a serious problem.
Yeah.
And the document definitely highlights that.
Before we wrap up this section, I wanted to share a couple of interesting tidbits about marine ecosystems. Did you know that the largest seagrass meadows in the world are found in Australia? And they play a crucial role in supporting marine biodiversity and storing carbon.
Wow, that's incredible. And some whales, like the humpback whale, they migrate thousands of kilometers every year between their breeding and feeding grounds.
It really shows you how connected our oceans are, and these fascinating insights just remind us how vast and complex the natural world is, and how important it is to understand it.
This has been a really great look at the diversity of ecosystems you find in India and all the challenges they're facing.
Yeah, it has. And we've got even more to explore in our final part. We'll be delving into biodiversity, conservation efforts, and the interconnectedness of it all.
Welcome back to our final part, exploring India's environment. We're diving into biodiversity, conservation, and how it all connects. One thing that really stands out is just how diverse life is in India.
Yeah, the document points out that India only covers about 2.4% of the world's land, but it's got something like 8% of all the species we know about.
That's wild. Like, how do they even fit it all in?
Well, it's because of India's varied landscapes, right? You've got the Himalayas, the coastlines, each with its own unique life.
It mentions these biogeographic zones, basically large areas with similar climates and life. Do these zones play a big role in India's biodiversity?
Absolutely. India's got 10 of them. Each adds to the richness. You've got the Trans-Himalayan zone, those high-altitude deserts, then the Western Ghats with those lush rainforests.
Like a patchwork of ecosystems, each one special. The document also mentions India's up there globally for mammals, birds, and reptiles.
Yes, 7th for mammals, 9th for birds, 5th for reptiles. But it's not just about the numbers, right? It's about the roles they play. They keep the ecosystems healthy.
The pollinators, the seed dispersers, the predators, they all work together. Sadly, the document also talks about the threats. Things like habitat loss, fragmentation, overexploitation. They all seem connected somehow.
They are. Like, habitat loss leads to fragmentation, isolating species, making them vulnerable. The document talks about how populations are declining, especially those on the IUCN Red List. Those are the threatened or endangered species.
So what are we doing to protect all this? The document mentions protected areas like national parks. Do those actually work?
Oh, they're super important. They offer different levels of protection. National parks are stricter than sanctuaries. Some famous ones in India are Kaziranga, known for its rhinos, and Jim Corbett, India's first national park.
They're not just good for the wildlife, but also for research and ecotourism.
Exactly. And there are species-specific programs too, like Project Tiger, started back in '73. It's really helped boost tiger numbers in India.
That's good to hear. Shows that focused efforts can really make a difference.
There are similar programs for elephants, vultures, snow leopards, and another important thing is creating corridors, strips of habitat connecting fragmented
Like
areas.
wildlife bridges.
Yeah, exactly. Helps them move around, keeps the genes flowing. That's how you keep populations healthy. But we can't forget about the people who live there, right?
Yeah. Does the document talk about getting communities involved?
It does. It highlights things like joint forest management. That's where you get local folks involved in protecting and managing the forests. They have so much knowledge, they can be real stewards of the environment.
Smart. Sustainable.
Mm.
The document also mentions India's environmental laws, stuff like the Wildlife Protection Act and the Forest Conservation Act. It sounds like they've got a good legal base for conservation.
They do. Those acts set the standards, hold people accountable. And there's the National Green Tribunal. They've been really good at tackling environmental violations.
So we've got the threats, the diversity, the protection efforts.
Mm.
The document really shows how complex it all is. It asks some tough questions,
Mm.
like how do you balance development with protecting the environment? What do you think about that?
It's tough. A lot of countries are going through rapid development. Economic growth is important. People need better lives, but not at the cost of destroying the environment. We need sustainable solutions. Good for people, good for the planet.
Another big one is what can we do as individuals to fight climate change and protect all this biodiversity?
That's where our everyday choices come in. We got to think about our carbon footprint, support sustainable practices. Little things add up when millions are doing them.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into India's environment, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
We've seen incredible biodiversity, the challenges, and what's being done to protect it. The bottom line is we're all connected. Our choices, they have ripple effects. Protecting the planet means understanding this, working together. It's about the future, a sustainable one.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Hopefully you've learned a thing or two and gotten those brains working. Keep exploring, and until next time, keep those deep diving minds engaged.